The salt-kissed air of Seagull Cove was a permanent fixture, a crisp, briny perfume that clung to the clapboard houses and winding cobblestone lanes. For Elara Vance, it was the scent of a new beginning, one she had painstakingly built with her own 2 hands, far from the cacophony and cruel disappointments of the city. This Sea Sprite Inn was her sanctuary, a 3-story Victorian jewel painted the color of a summer sky, with shutters the deep green of the surrounding pines. From its wide wraparound porch, one could watch the Atlantic Ocean paint its daily masterpiece of shifting blues and grays. This particular morning, Elara was wrestling with a particularly stubborn hydrangea bush, its vibrant blue blooms a testament to her relentless care. At 42, she found a profound satisfaction in the quiet dialogue between her hands and the earth. It was honest work with predictable rewards. A well-tended plant bloomed. A well-made bed earned a guest's grateful smile. It was a world away from the emotional quagmire of her past, from the charming lawyer with a liar's smile who had convinced her that love was a beautifully wrapped empty box. Sworn-off men, sworn on chocolate and a good book, she muttered to herself, yanking a weed with more force than necessary. It was her personal mantra. Romance, she had decided, was a delightful fiction for other people, a dangerous distraction for her. Her reverie was broken by the familiar, gruff sound of a diesel engine rumbling to a stop. She didn't need to look up to know it was Captain Samuel Thorne. Every Tuesday, like nautical clockwork, he arrived for his weekly breakfast. Retired from a life at sea, he was now Seagull Cove's most enduring and endearing bachelor. At 55, he carried his height with a straight-backed authority that spoke of decades commanding decks in all weathers. His hair was a thick, silver-gray mane, his face a roadmap of sun-weathered lines, and his eyes the color of stormy sea. He was, the town gossips whispered with a fond sigh, tragically handsome and permanently, stubbornly single. Elara watched him from under the wide brim of her sun hat. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible roll in his gait, as if the solid ground was still a deck pitching beneath his feet. He saw her and gave a curt, single nod. "Miss Vance." "Captain Thorne," she replied, her tone as polite and cool as the morning shade. "Your usual table is ready." He merely grunted in response and strode past her into the inn. Elara followed, wiping her hands on her trousers. The dining room was her pride. All light oak floors, white linen tablecloths, and windows that flooded the space with light. Samuel Thorne always sat at the small table in the corner, the one with the best view of the harbor and his own sloop, the Wayfarer, bobbing gently at its mooring. Martha, Elara's sprightly 70-year-old waitress and resident town crier, was already pouring his coffee. "Morning, Captain. A fine day, isn't it?" Heard the Henderson boys' lobster catch was the best of the season. Samuel accepted the coffee with a quiet "Thank you, Martha." He didn't engage in further chatter, instead opening the morning's nautical chart he always brought with him. This was their ritual. He would order the full Irish breakfast, eat it with methodical precision while studying his charts of waters he no longer sailed, and then depart with the same quiet efficiency. Elara busied herself behind the front desk, pretending to check reservations. She found the captain an enigma. He was never rude, but he built a wall of silence around himself as formidable as a sea wall against a gale. The town lore was that he'd loved once, a woman lost to a storm or perhaps to the land itself, and his heart had been scuttled along with his career. She could understand that. She respected it. In a way, they were kindred spirits, two souls who had declared emotional bankruptcy and were now living quiet, solvent lives. As he was leaving, he paused at the desk. "The scones were particularly good today, Miss Vance." It was the most he'd said to her in weeks. Elara looked up, startled. "Thank you, Captain. I added a bit of orange zest." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and in that fleeting second, she saw something in his stormy eyes. Not a storm, but a calm, deep curiosity. Then it was gone, veiled behind his usual reserve. He nodded again and walked out. Elara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It meant nothing. she told herself firmly. Just a comment on a scone. But for the first time in a long time, the walls of her carefully constructed sanctuary felt a little less solid. Samuel Thorne walked the short distance from the inn to the town dock, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps on the cobbles doing little to settle the unfamiliar disquiet in his chest. Elara Vance was a puzzle. A beautiful, composed, and infuriatingly self-sufficient puzzle. He'd been coming to the Sea Sprite for over a year, ever since he'd retired and moved into his grandfather's old cottage on the bluff. He told himself it was for the consistency, for the quality of the coffee. But he knew, in the deep, honest part of himself he usually ignored, that it was for her. She had a quiet strength he admired, a grace under pressure he'd seen once when a pipe burst in the guest kitchen, and she'd handled it with a calm efficiency that would have made his first mate proud. She didn't flirt, didn't simper, didn't try to engage him in the meaningless chatter he so despised. She was like a safe harbor after a lifetime of treacherous seas, and he wanted no part of it. Love was a liability. He'd learned that the hard way. Isabella hadn't been lost to a storm. She'd been lost to the lure of a more exciting, more stable life with a man who wasn't always 6 months away at sea. Her parting words still echoed in the quiet of his cottage. "I can't love a ghost, Sam. I need a man who's present." He'd given the sea his life, and in return, it had taken his marriage and left him with a hollowed-out heart. He was done with it. The sea was a demanding mistress, and he'd retired from her service, too. He reached his sloop, the Wayfarer, and ran a hand along her smooth, varnished rail. This was his freedom now. Day trips, solo sails, no crew to manage, no cargo to deliver, no one to disappoint or be disappointed by. "Afternoon, Sam," called out old Ben, the harbor master. "See you're still making eyes at the B&B lady." Samuel stiffened. "I do no such thing, Ben. I take my breakfast there. It's a commercial transaction." Ben chuckled, a sound like gravel being shaken in a can. "Aye, a transaction. And the tide comes in because the moon tells it to. Just a natural force, is it?" He winked and ambled away. Samuel scowled. The entire town, it seemed, was invested in a romance that didn't exist. He was a perennial bachelor because he chose to be. She was a closed book because she, too, had her reasons. It was a perfect, if silent, understanding. But as he cast off the lines and the Wayfarer drifted into the channel, his thoughts drifted back to Elara, to the way a stray curl had escaped her bun and clung to her damp temple, to the fierce concentration in her eyes as she wrestled with that hydrangea. She wasn't like Isabella. She was rooted like the old oak tree behind his cottage. And for a man who had spent his life adrift, the idea of something so steadfast was dangerously alluring. The storm rolled in from the northeast with a vengeful fury, a classic nor'easter that turned the sky the color of lead and the sea into a churning, white-capped monster. The wind howled around the Sea Sprite Inn, rattling the old windows in their frames. Elara moved from room to room, lighting lamps and starting a fire in the great stone hearth. The power had flickered out an hour ago. She had only one guest, an elderly writer who had cheerfully declared the atmosphere perfectly Gothic and retired to his room with a battery-powered lantern and a notebook. The inn was otherwise empty, a vast, creaking ship in the midst of a gale. It was then, through the drumming rain, that she heard a frantic knocking at the front door. Puzzled, she pulled it open, the wind immediately snatching it from her hand and slamming it against the wall. Standing on her porch, soaked to the bone and shivering violently, was Samuel Thorne. He was holding a small, terrified, and equally drenched tabby kitten in his large, cupped hands. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice rough above the wind. "I apologize for the intrusion. I found her. She was trapped in the rocks below the bluff. My cottage, the roof has sprung a leak. A bad one. In the bedroom. I have nowhere else." He trailed off, looking more vulnerable and uncertain than she had ever seen him. The mighty ship captain, brought low by a storm and a kitten. "Good heavens, come in," Elara exclaimed, her practical nature overriding her surprise. She hauled the door shut against the gale. "You're freezing, and the poor little thing." She ushered him towards the roaring fire. Samuel stood stiffly on the hearthrug, water pooling around his boots. He gently placed the shivering kitten on the warm stones, where it let out a pitiful mewl. "Let me get you a towel," Elara said, her mind already racing. "And some dry clothes. My father, he left some things here. I think they'll fit." Before he could protest, she was gone, returning with a stack of thick towels and a pair of flannel trousers and a wool sweater. "The bathroom is down the hall. Get changed. I'll see to our little stowaway." Samuel hesitated for only a moment before nodding his gratitude and disappearing down the hall. Elara knelt by the fire, wrapping the kitten in a soft towel and rubbing it gently until its shivering subsided and a faint, rumbling purr began to emanate from its tiny body. When Samuel returned, he looked different. Out of his usual uniform of waxed jacket and sturdy trousers, dressed in her father's soft, civilian clothes, he seemed less the formidable captain and more a man. A tired, handsome, surprisingly approachable man. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now. "The kitten, I heard her crying. Couldn't leave her." Elara felt something shift inside her, a lock turning in a long rusted mechanism. "Of course you couldn't," she said, and she meant it. She handed him a mug of hot tea, laced with a generous splash of whiskey. "Here, this will warm you up." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside, a safe, warm cocoon inside. The kitten, now dry and warm, curled into a tiny ball on the hearth and fell asleep. "It's a bad one," Samuel said finally, gazing into the flames. "Reminds me of a blow off the Cape of Good Hope. Waves as high as a church steeple." "Were you ever afraid?" Elara asked, genuinely curious. "Terrified," he admitted without a hint of shame. "Any captain who says otherwise is a fool or a liar. But fear is a tool. It keeps you sharp, makes you respect the sea." He looked at her. "And you? Are you afraid of storms?" Elara considered this. Not of the storm itself, but of what it could do to this place. "This is all I have." He nodded slowly. "I understand. A ship is the same for a captain. It's not just wood and sails. It's home." In that moment, surrounded by the fury of the elements, a bridge was built between them. It was made of shared silence, a rescued kitten, and the quiet understanding of two people who had staked their lives on their own personal vessels. The storm broke at dawn, leaving a world washed clean and sparkling. Samuel, after a surprisingly comfortable night on the inn's plush sofa, prepared to leave. The kitten, now christened Gale by Elara, was weaving figure eights around his ankles. "I can't thank you enough, Miss Vance," he said, standing by the door, back in his own dry but stiff clothes. "Elara," she said. "Please call me Elara." "And it was no trouble, Captain." "Samuel," he replied. "My name is Samuel." He looked down at the kitten, then back at her. "Perhaps I could stop by later to check on her." Elara felt a small, warm spark ignite in her chest. "I think she'd like that. And so would I." And so began a new, unspoken ritual. Samuel started coming to the sea, Sprite, not just on Tuesdays, but on other days, under the pretext of checking on Gale. He'd bring a fresh-caught mackerel for the cat, or a bag of coffee beans from the local roastery for Elara. Their conversations, once limited to the weather and the quality of baked goods, began to deepen. He told her about the ports of call he'd seen, the strange, lonely beauty of the open ocean. She told him about her life before Seagull Cove, about the corporate job that had drained her soul and the relationship that had broken her trust. She didn't go into sordid detail, but she spoke of the feeling of being an empty vessel. "I know that feeling," Samuel said one evening, as they shared a bottle of wine on the porch. "Coming back to a quiet house after months at sea. The silence isn't peaceful. It's heavy." "Yes," Elara whispered, looking at him. "Exactly." They began taking walks together along the coastal path. He was a man of few words, but he spoke volumes in the way he pointed out a changing wind, or identified a bird on the wing, or offered a steadying hand on a slippery part of the trail. Elara found his quiet solidity a profound comfort. He was not a man of grand, empty gestures, but of small, meaningful actions. The town, of course, noticed. Martha's eyes twinkled every time Samuel walked in. Ben would give Samuel a knowing slap on the back of the docks. They were becoming Sam and Elara, a unit, and the cove approved. For the first time in years, Elara's mantra of sworn-off men began to feel less like a shield and more like a cage she had willingly locked herself inside. And for the first time since he hauled anchor for the last time, Samuel felt the stirrings of a longing for a different kind of voyage, one with a destination that was a person, not a port. The Seagull Cove Summer Festival was the highlight of the town's social calendar. The green was filled with booths, the air smelled of fried dough and saltwater taffy, and a local band played cheerful, if slightly off-key, folk music. It was a celebration of community, and this year, Elara and Samuel found themselves at the heart of it, wandering through the crowds together. It felt natural, easy. He won her a small, stuffed anchor at the ring toss booth. She convinced him to try a bite of her blueberry pie, and he, in turn, bought them both lobster rolls from his favorite shack. They were, to any outside observer, a couple. A mature, somewhat reserved, but palpably content couple, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. They found a quiet bench overlooking the now calm harbor. The lights from the moored boats twinkled like fallen stars. "Elara," Samuel began, his voice uncharacteristically tentative. He reached for her hand, his large, calloused one enveloping hers. It felt like coming home. "These past few months, they've meant a great deal to me." She looked at their joined hands, then up into his stormy eyes, which were now soft and clear. "To me as well, Samuel. I know we both had decided to go it alone," he said. "But being with you, it doesn't feel like a compromise. It feels like finding a safe harbor I never knew I was searching for." It was the most poetic thing she had ever heard him say. Her heart swelled, beating a joyous, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. She leaned into him, and his arm came around her shoulders, solid and sure. "I feel the same," she confessed. "You've made me believe that not all voyages end in shipwrecks." He smiled, a genuine, transformative smile that smoothed the weathered lines of his face and made him look years younger. He was about to speak, to perhaps lean in and kiss her, when a voice, sharp and saccharine, cut through the twilight. Well, Samuel Thorne, I heard you'd run aground in this quaint little backwater." They both turned. Standing before them was a woman. She was impeccably dressed in a way that screamed of city money, her blonde hair sleek and perfect, her face artfully preserved against time. She was beautiful, but it was a cold, hard beauty. Samuel's body went rigid. The arm around Elara's shoulders tightened, but not in a comforting way. It was a reflex of shock. "Isabella," he said, his voice a flat, hard thing. Isabella's smile was a razor blade. "Hello, Sam. Aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" Her eyes swept over Elara, taking in her simple sundress and wind-tousled hair with dismissive efficiency. Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This was Isabella. The Isabella, the one who had scuttled his heart. "This is Elara Vance," Samuel said, his voice strained. "Elara, this is Isabella, my ex-wife." The world, which moments before had felt so warm and full of promise, suddenly tilted on its axis. The safe harbor had just been breached by a ghost from the past. Isabella had come to Seagull Cove, she claimed, to tie up some loose ends from their long-defunct marriage. A small shared investment, she'd suddenly remembered. Samuel was cynical. He suspected it was more to do with the fact her latest relationship had ended and she was bored. Her presence was a poison in the clean salt air. She took a room at the fanciest hotel in the next town over, but seemed to spend all her time in Seagull Cove, inserting herself into Samuel and Elara's budding relationship with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. She would show up at the Sea Sprite with a flimsy excuse, criticizing the decor with a backhanded compliment. So charmingly rustic, she'd purr. She'd reminisce loudly about her life with Samuel, about parties in Singapore and sunsets in Santorini, painting a picture of a glamorous, global life that Elara's quiet world of scones and hydrangeas could never compete with. Samuel became withdrawn, retreating behind the old, impenetrable wall. He was polite to Isabella, but the easy warmth he had found with Elara vanished, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The town watched the drama unfold with bated breath, their collective opinion of Isabella lower than a snake's belly. The breaking point came at the weekly farmer's market. Isabella was holding court, complaining about the lack of organic kale, when Samuel finally snapped. "For God's sake, Isabella, it's a farmer's market in a coastal Maine town, not a boutique in Manhattan." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Oh, I see. You've fully embraced the simple life, haven't you, Sam? Hiding from the world. I heard you don't even sail beyond the cove anymore. You've become small." Elara saw the words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He flinched, the old wound ripped wide open. The accusation that he was hiding, that he was less than he used to be. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his back ramrod straight. Isabella turned her triumphant gaze on Elara. "He's a complicated man, dear. You have to understand the life he led. It's not for the faint of heart. Some of us are built for adventure, and some of us are built to, well, to keep it tidy in." That was it. The gauntlet had been thrown. Elara felt a surge of anger, not just at Isabella's cruelty, but at Samuel's retreat. The conflict she had dreaded, the threat to her peaceful life, had arrived not as a slow tide, but as a tsunami. Elara found Samuel on the bluff, standing before his cottage, staring out at the sea. The wayfarer sat idle in the harbor below. "You can't let her do this, Samuel," Elara said, her voice firm, though her hands were trembling. "Do what?" he said, not looking at her. "She's just stating facts. I have retired. I don't sail beyond the cove. Because you choose not to. There's a difference between hiding and choosing a different path. What we have, I thought it was real. But if a few words from your ex-wife can make you doubt it, and doubt yourself, then maybe I was wrong." Now he turned to look at her, his eyes haunted. "You don't understand, Elara. That life, it cost me everything. It cost me my marriage. Isabella was right about one thing. I was never there. I was married to the sea, and I failed at it. I failed as a husband. But you're going to punish yourself forever? And punish me in the process." Elara's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "I'm not Isabella, Samuel. I don't want the man who sails the seven seas. I want the man who rescues kittens in a storm and shares a bottle of wine on my porch. I want the man who is here, present." "But is that enough?" he asked, the question ripped from a deep, vulnerable place. "Or will you wake up one day and realize you've settled for a shadow of a man?" Elara stared at him, her heart shattering. He was so lost in his own past, in his own perceived failures, that he couldn't see the strong, good man standing right in front of her. "I'm not settling," she whispered. "I thought I was upgrading." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone on the bluff. It was over before it had truly begun. The walls were back up, higher and stronger than ever. She had opened her heart, only to have it feel the familiar sting of rejection. She had been a fool to believe her story could have a different ending. The days that followed were gray and hollow. Samuel didn't come to the inn. Isabella, having achieved her destructive goal, left Seagull Cove as suddenly as she had arrived, leaving a trail of bitter silence in her wake. Elara threw herself into her work, pruning her gardens with a ferocious intensity, baking until the pantry was overflowing. But the inn felt empty and silent, the ghost of Samuel's presence haunting every corner. Gail the kitten would sit by the door at Samuel's usual time, mewing in confusion. Samuel, meanwhile, was adrift. The cottage felt like a prison. Elara's words echoed in his mind. "I want the man who is here, present." He had been so busy defining himself by what he was not, no longer a captain, no longer a husband, that he had forgotten to figure out who he was now. He spent days walking the cliffs, staring at the wayfarer. He wasn't hiding, he told himself. He was just retired. But the sea still called to him, a siren song of freedom and purpose. Isabella's words had been venomous, but they had also held a kernel of a challenge. Had he retired, or had he simply run aground? He thought of Elara, her strength, her kindness, the way she looked at him not as a retired captain, but as a man, a whole man. She had seen his present, and she had chosen it, and he had thrown it away out of fear. It was old Ben who finally gave him the push he needed. He found Samuel mending nets on the dock, a task he'd done 1,000 times before. "Mooning over that B&B woman, are you?" Ben asked, not unkindly. Samuel grunted. "You're a damned fool, Sam Thorne," Ben said bluntly. "That woman looks at you like you hung the moon and stars. My Mabel looked at me like that for 50 years. A man doesn't get a second chance at that very often. The question is, are you going to let your past steer your ship, or are you going to take the wheel yourself?" Samuel looked up, Ben's words cutting through the fog of his self-pity. Take the wheel. He was a captain, for heaven's sake. It was what he did. He had been so afraid of failing again, of not being enough, that he had chosen not to try at all. But in doing so, he had already failed. He had lost Elara. It was time to set a new course. A week after their fight, a large, flat package was delivered to the Sea Sprite Inn, addressed to Elara, with no return address. Puzzled, she opened it. Inside was a nautical chart, but it wasn't a chart of distant oceans. It was a beautifully illustrated, hand-drawn map of Seagull Cove. It was incredibly detailed, showing the coastal path, the harbor, the bluff. And there, marked with a small, careful X, were all their spots. The bench where they'd watched the festival, the rocky outcropping where they'd first seen a pod of dolphins, the spot on the porch where they'd shared their first bottle of wine. Tears sprang to Elara's eyes. It was the most thoughtful, personal gift she had ever received. Tucked into the corner was a note, written in Samuel's strong, clear hand. "Elara, a captain is nothing without his charts. They show him where he is and guide him to where he wants to be. For too long, my chart was blank. You have shown me my new coordinates. You are my destination. If you can find it in your heart, meet me at our bench at sunset. I have a voyage to propose." Samuel, her heart hammered against her ribs. Hope, fragile and beautiful, began to bloom once more. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Elara walked to the bench. He was already there, standing tall, dressed in his simple clothes, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked nervous. "Samuel," she said softly. He turned, and the look in his eyes was one of utter clarity and determination. "Elara, thank you for coming." He gestured for her to sit, and he sat beside her, turning to face her. "I have been a fool," he began. "The greatest fool to ever sail the seven seas. I let the ghost of a failed past cloud my vision of a beautiful future. Isabella was wrong. I'm not hiding. I've just found a better port." He took her hands in his. "You were right. I am present, and I am choosing to be present with you." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a young man with grand, empty promises. So I have a practical proposal. A voyage, not across an ocean, but across a lifetime. I propose we sail it together. You as the owner of this beautiful harbor, and me as the captain who is lucky enough to call it home." Elara's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of joy. She looked at this strong, proud, vulnerable man who had fought his way through his own storm to reach her. "It's a long voyage," she said, a smile breaking through her tears. "There might be storms." "Aye," he said, a smile finally touching his own eyes. "But we'll face them together. A good captain always knows a safe harbor is his greatest asset." "And a good harbor master," Elara replied, leaning forward, "knows that a true captain is worth his weight in gold." This time, there was no interruption. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was both a promise and a homecoming. It was salted with the sea air and sweet with the taste of a future they would now chart together. 1 year later, the Sea Sprite Inn was bustling with activity. The scent of Elara's famous orange zest scones filled the air. On the front porch, in a patch of sunlight, a full-grown gale lay purring contently on the lap of Samuel Thorne. Samuel, who now officially helped Elara run the inn, handling the maintenance with a sailor's efficiency and charming the guests with his quiet, weathered stories, looked out over the cove. His sloop, the Wayfarer, had a new coat of varnish and was ready for the afternoon. But he was in no rush. Elara came out, wiping her hands on her apron, and sat beside him. He slipped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Happy anniversary," she whispered, kissing his cheek. "It's not our anniversary," he said, confused. "Of course it is," she smiled. "It's the anniversary of the day you brought a wet kitten and your stubborn heart to my door." Samuel chuckled, a rich, warm sound that had become as familiar to the inn as the sound of the sea. "Aye, Captain," he said, using the affectionate nickname he'd given her. Then happy anniversary. He looked from his wife, for they had been married in a small, simple ceremony on that very porch 6 months ago, to the sea, and then back to her. He was no longer a retired ship captain or a perennial bachelor. He was a husband, a partner. He was finally home. His heart, once a ship lost in a fog of regret, was now securely, joyfully anchored.